Bible with me to Acts chapter 27, and let me just say there are 28 chapters in the book of Acts. Thanks for those amen. I'll tell you, it'll certainly be for me bittersweet when we finish the book of Acts. Goodness gracious. You know that you all have experienced in your life when you get to share with somebody or teach somebody that you get more than everybody else does. And I'll tell you, this study through the book of Acts has really been great for me in my life and my journey. So Paul's been on trial for a dozen times now. Everybody knows he's innocent, but nobody has the political backbone to set him free because the religious folks in Jerusalem wield so much political power. Last week, you remember that Paul stood before Governor Festus. He was the Roman guy. King Herod Agrippa, he was the Jewish king. His sister Bernice, what a messed up situation that is, and all of the prominent people in Caesarea and all of their pomp. That's who Paul stood before. And you remember last week, Paul just shucks it to the cob in his defense, because he simply tells the story about how he used to be an angry, hate-filled religious person. Let those phrases settle in for a minute. An angry, hate-filled religious person. When we think of religious people, that's not necessarily how we think about it, but that's exactly who Paul was. And then he tells them how he met Jesus, and his life changed instantly, entirely, completely for him. Paul turned directly toward King Herod Agrippa and asked him, he said, King Herod Agrippa, you believe, don't you? And Agrippa echoed those chilling words, are you going to persuade me to become a Christian so easily? The King James, you remember that Agrippa said, you almost persuaded me to become a Christian. There's that old hymn called Almost Persuaded. It's based on that verse. Almost but lost. We never hear from King Agrippa again after that. King Agrippa consults with Festus, and he concludes in the last verse of Acts chapter 26 last week, verse 32, then Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar. And again, Paul is certainly thinking, well, I would not have appealed to Caesar if one of you guys had manned up and let me go to start with. We never hear from Agrippa again. We never hear from Festus again. The Jews are finally out of the picture. And Paul is bound, literally, for Rome. Today, Paul sails into a shipwreck. The storm catches up with them and overwhelms them. All is lost except for hope. This journey that we're going to study today in Acts chapter 27 is a multi-week. It's over a period of multiple weeks, covering several hundred miles with all of the drama of a Castaway or a Titanic or a Gilligan's Island. Dr. Swindoll titled this chapter in his commentary, How to Enjoy a Shipwreck. You may recall that the chaplain at Faith Home, Randy Oots, was here back in April, and the Faith Home choir came to sing, and the passage for his message that night was this same passage, Acts chapter 27, and he titled his message, Looseness Leads to Lostness. Using a casserole of those thoughts, I've titled the message today, Hope Floats. I'll probably refer to those fellas in different messages, but hope floats. I want to show the map this morning, and I'm going to leave it up for the first about 20 verses. We are on the green line there, starting at Caesarea, going to Tyre up the side and coming up over here, floating around out here, lost, shipwrecked, finally land on Malta. That's where we're going to end up at. I want to leave that up as the narrative unfolds. Verse 1. When it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. It says there, when it was decided that we, who is we referring to? First person, Dr. Luke. So Dr. Luke is there. He's on the boat headed to Rome. Pretty amazing. Paul is a prisoner, but Dr. Luke's on the boat. When it was decided, we don't have any specific time frame. Sometimes Dr. Luke gives us very specifics, like 7 days or 10 days, or it happened on this date. Sometimes he gives it more generic. Here it's when it was time, whenever it was time. It doesn't tell us how long he stayed there in Caesarea, for a few days or a few weeks, but sometime it was finally decided They probably had to wait till they got a boatload of prisoners. Think about that. They're in Caesarea and they're headed to Italy with some prisoners. They probably had to wait till they got a boatload of prisoners. I don't know how long it takes to accumulate a boatload of prisoners. And then we see a centurion named Julius. And remember with me that throughout the book of Acts, we have, or through the New Testament, we have encountered many centurions. Do you remember what a centurion is? He's a Roman soldier who has responsibility for how many soldiers? 100. Centurion means 100. These kind of sergeants that had 100 people work under them, we've seen them over and over. Do you remember in Matthew chapter 8 where Jesus heals a centurion's son? A centurion sends a man to go to Jesus and say, please tell him to come to my house. And Jesus says, no, I don't need to go to your house. I see your faith, Mr. Centurion. I'll heal you from there. Do you remember in Matthew chapter 27, at the foot of the cross, after Jesus hangs there and dies, it was a centurion that looked and said, truly, this man was the Son of God. One of these Roman sergeants. Remember in Acts chapter 10, that great kill and eat passage where the Lord tells Peter, look, kill and eat, you're going to go eat this unclean food. And Peter says, no, I don't do that. Well, yeah, you are going to do that. So Peter gets up and goes up to Caesarea, where we're at, to the house of Sergeant, we call him Sergeant Cornelius. He was a centurion. Peter went to his house because Cornelius had been praying for many, many days, and the Lord told him, send a guy down here to Joppa to find Peter, and Peter came up there and shared the gospel, and Cornelius' entire house became Christians. The centurion named Cornelius. And then you remember that it was a centurion named Claudius Lysias that saved Paul's life in Jerusalem for the Jews and wrote a letter and sent a letter with Paul to go to Caesarea. We have seen, amazingly, these Roman soldiers, these centurions, over and over in the Scripture, and every time we're confronted with them, they have some kind of experience with the Lord or friendliness or kindness toward the people of God. It's pretty amazing. So today we've got a new centurion. His name is Julius of the Imperial Regiment. That probably is some kind of status, some group with a stature. He's of the Imperial Regiment. There's different commentary about what that means. He was chosen to be in charge of this mission, a transoceanic prisoner transport. That's what Julius was going to do for us. Verse 2, so when we had boarded a ship of Atramidium, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. So here is where they started from. They found a boat that was headed up here to Atramidium, that's up here near this little island of Lesbos. What Julius was trying to do was to find a boat that was headed west, because he was trying to get over here to Rome. First boat he could find, are you headed west? Yes, we're going to jump on. Obviously, he wasn't going to stay on that boat because it was going here and they were going over here. So they got on the boat and they intended to sail right along the coast. They intended to sail right along the coast of Asia here. Aristarchus, this is the end of verse 2, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Now you may remember that there were a group of people from way up here that traveled with Paul when he came back to Jerusalem, and Aristarchus was one of those people. And Gaius and Timothy was there, and Dr. Luke was there. Why Dr. Luke calls out Aristarchus is unclear. It doesn't make any sense. Was Aristarchus one of the prisoners with Paul, or was Aristarchus just one of the companions of Paul like Dr. Luke was? It doesn't tell us. Although I will tell you that over in Colossians chapter 4, Paul refers to Aristarchus as my fellow prisoner. So at some point, Aristarchus became a prisoner with Paul. So they jump on the ship and they're trying to stay along the coast of Asia. Verse 3, the next day we put in at Sidon. So this ship must have been just going from Caesarea to Sidon. And when we found another ship there, when we got there, amazingly, verse 3, Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. It's entirely possible that Julius already knew Paul back in Caesarea. Y'all, it's just amazing that Paul had gained the favor. He gained the favor of Felix and Festus, and King Agrippa, and probably Julius here. How many prisoners do you imagine that Julius had ever let off a ship and go visit his friends? Now, Paul, be back at 4 o'clock because we're sailing, Mr. Prisoner. Don't try to escape. Paul had gained that much favor
with Julius and with all of the people he came in contact with. As a prisoner, he gained that much favor to allow for Julius to allow him to go to his friends and receive their care. Verse 4. When we put out to sea from there, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds are against us. We sailed along this northern coast right here. It looks like the winds were probably pushing them north at this point. Verse 5, after sailing through the open sea off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we reached Myra in Lycia. Myra is right there in Lycia, this little province right here. So they made it that far. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So when we got to Myra, we really didn't want to go all the way up here to Adramyttium. So Julius found another ship that was an Alexandrian ship that started down here in Egypt, and it was no doubt coming up here to deliver its goods, and it was headed to Italy, and Julius said, let's jump on that one instead. That was a cargo ship carrying grain. Keep that in mind as the story progresses. Verse 7, sailing slowly for many days, we came with difficulty as far as Cnidus. Now, this was Myra, and only right here is Cnidus. That's a very short span of distance, but it took many days to get there because the winds were blowing in their face so strongly. Verse 8, with more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called, let me finish verse 7. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salmone. So they left Cnidus after many days from here to here. They headed down here. They were headed toward Crete, but now apparently the winds had changed direction and they were blowing south hard enough that they could not make it to Crete. It took them down along the south side of Crete. When they finally got along the south side, they had a little bit of protection apparently from the wind because of the land, and they were able to dock at this little place called Fair Haven near Lycia. And you look and see the lines here are relatively straight, but you know that their diesel engines had died at this point, and they were sailing with the wind. And so when the wind would blow this way, and they needed to go that way, they would tack. That's called tacking, back and forth into the wind. They'd go a little bit here, and then the wind would change, and they'd change the direction of the sails. And so no doubt, their entire path looked like this as they sailed. And as they were sailing, trying to get over to Crete, the wind was no doubt blowing so hard to the south that they could not turn to the east. And so they ended up coming along the bottom of the south side of Crete. Verse 9, by now much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous. Since the fast was already over, Paul gave his advice. The Holman Christian Standard says that sailing was dangerous from mid-September to mid-November, and the waterways were closed from then until February. The fast had ended. The fast was already over. It appears that Paul's journey happened sometime in mid-October. We know that here as hurricane season. They were sailing during hurricane season with cloth sails and no diesel engine. Then verse 9 said Paul gave his advice. He stood up in verse 10. Paul gave his advice and told them, men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward damage and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. And I just remind you that Paul understood that he was going to Rome because God said to him, you're going to Rome. Even then, especially then, it was incumbent upon them to use wisdom in their lives. Even though Paul knew where he was going, they needed to use wisdom. And I just say to you that in our lives, this verse emphasizes that there is a fine line between acting in faith versus acting foolishly. Paul knew in faith that he was going to make it to Rome. He knew the end. But he also knew that there was an easy way to get there and there was a hard way to get there. And he was trying to tell them, y'all, I think we need to take the easier way. You can take that home with you. God is going to execute his purpose in his plan in your life, in my life. There's an easy way that can happen, and there's a hard way that can happen. We've seen that throughout Scripture. what perhaps is most noteworthy in this verse is that Paul actually had the confidence to stand up and say anything at all. Remember, he was at the bottom of the totem pole. There was the captain of the ship, and there was the assistant captain of the ship, and there were all of the sailors, and there was the Roman centurion named Julius, and there were his 100 soldiers that were in charge, and the bottom feeder at the very bottom of the totem pole was Paul. But Paul is the guy the one person on board who had the courage to stand up and say, y'all, I think we're making the wrong decision here. In summary, Paul owned and he spoke the words of truth. He said, men, I can see this voyage is headed toward damage and heavy loss not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Verse 11 said the centurion paid attention. The centurion Julius, he's the guy now who's kind of taking charge, and he's the one that can make the decision, do we sail or not sail? The centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. Verse 12, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, so apparently in this little Fair Haven, it's a little cove. And for those of you who've lived in a cove, you know when the wind comes, it just beats and bangs and there's nowhere for it to disperse. It just gets pounded. So they were in Fair Haven in this little cove and the winds were going to come on them. So they were trying to make it over here to Phoenix on the island, the western side of Crete, because since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to sail from there, hoping to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete that was more open to the southwest and the northwest, and to winter there. That's where they were going to try to get to. Even though Paul had gained their favor and he spoke words of wisdom and hope and life, he was not recognized as sailing expert. We're hearing you, Paul, but we defer to the seasoned experts. Pastor Oots, on his notes that he sent to me this week, I told you that he preached this message. I asked him for the notes, and he mailed them to me, his scribbled out notes. Pastor Oots scribbled these words, the voice of the crowd is too loose. They ignored the words of the preacher. I don't want to stand up here and say that I have all of the knowledge and all of the truth, but I will say that I stand on the words of this book, and the words of this book have words of life and wisdom and hope and direction. Pastor Oots just made the point, they should have listened to the preacher Paul. They should have listened to him. Prior to the storm, some folks act invincibly. It doesn't matter. The majority of folks can certainly be wrong when they give us advice. The storms of life might come at you, and they will directly affect those around you. Verse 13, when a gentle south wind sprang up. A south wind means it was blowing from the south. A gentle south wind sprung up, which should help them, push them. They could tack into the wind to the west, and the gentle south wind would help them land softly in Phoenix. A gentle south wind sprang up. They thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor, they pulled the anchor up, and sailed along the shore of Crete. Randy Oots, Pastor Oots wrote these words, the voice of the circumstances, soft winds, going with the flow, no conflict. It looked like, the circumstances looked like this was the perfect path to take. And can I just simply remind you that the words easy and soft are not in the Bible's dictionary when it comes to the Christian life. I know a lot of people make decisions in their lives because it's easy or because it feels good. And I'd say to you as a challenge, you and I, as Christians, that easy and soft and gentle are not necessarily in the vocabulary of what God is asking us to do. Often what God asks us to do is to do the very hard thing. Randy Oots, Pastor Oots, wrote, the voice of the supposing. They thought or they supposed or they assumed because the circumstances looked good that it was safe to sail. Verse 14, but not long afterward, a fierce wind called the northeaster. Now, I don't remember what the King James called it. We would call it a nor'easter. Then in the South, a nor'easter. But they spelled it out in the Home Christian. A fierce wind called the northeaster rushed down from the island. And now the winds have changed from this gentle wind from the north to this fierce storm pushing down from the south. And they're trying to make it. They just got to make it from Fair Haven around the corner to Phoenix. But the south wind came and blew them completely off course. Now they're headed straight for Egypt. That's not where they were headed to. Not long afterward, a fierce wind called the northeaster rushed down from the island. So the plot thickens, verse 16. The ship was caught and was unable to head into the wind. We gave way to it and were driven along. The wind's blowing hard enough now. The sails are completely ineffective. We just shut the sails down and how did it say it? We gave way to it. Well, storm, you're stronger than us. We're going to give way to it. And we were driven along into the wind, trapped in the storm. And I'll say to you that I don't want to spiritualize every verse, but I was reminded of the words of this song, that sin will take you farther than you want to go. And it'll keep you longer than you want to stay. And it'll cost you more than you want to pay. That ain't what these soldiers have bargained for when they got off the ship. Thought they were going around the corner. That's what Satan does to us, doesn't he? He says, this is a great thing. You need to try it. Look at the gentle winds. Life is good. Just try it. You'll like it. And Satan gets us trapped. We were unable to head in the wind. We gave way to it. We were trapped by this storm. Verse 16, after running under the shelter of a little island called Calda, you kind of barely see that little island right there. They maybe got a little bit of temporary relief from it going south on that storm. After running the shelter of a little island called Calda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. The skiff was the little rescue boat that was tied to the boat. So if we finally get somewhere and we get close and we get near the shore, we can get the skiff and ride safely to shore. We were barely able to grab control of the skiff, our rescue boat. 17, after hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship. Then, fearing the ship would run aground on the Syrtis was some sandbanks down near Egypt. Fearing we would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the drift anchor. The drift anchor was an anchor that you lower. It doesn't go all the way to the ground and stop you, but it goes down there and it slows you down and helps the drift. And if they happened to land or hit land, it would stop the boat. They dropped the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along by the wind. They used ropes and tackle and girded the ship, verse 17 says. Basically what that means, they took the ropes and they duct taped the boat together so it wouldn't come apart. Because they didn't have duct tape, so they roped it together. They took the ropes and the tackle and girded the ship. Whenever I was flying, there's an adage in flying that says, better to be on the ground and wish you were in the air than to be in the air and wish you were on the ground. Better to be stuck at Fairhaven and wish that you were at Phoenix than to try to go to Phoenix and wish you could make it safely somewhere. Out in the middle of nowhere they were. Verse 18, because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. What a great word that is, jettison. It's like they put it on a slingshot and slung it off the ship. They started throwing cargo off because they were trying to lighten the ship so it wouldn't sit down so low in the water in the middle of this storm. On the third day, verse 19, they threw the ship's gear overboard with their own hands. Kind of feels like you're almost committing suicide when you just take the gear, the necessary stuff, and you're throwing it overboard. So they jettisoned the cargo and the gear to lighten the loads, the first aid kit, the ropes, the tools. Pastor Root says they loosed the necessary things, started getting rid of stuff they needed to survive with. Verse 20, for many days neither the sun nor the stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope that we would be saved was disappearing. Neither the sun or the stars appeared for days. That was significant because the batteries on their GPS was broke too. They were dead too. They used the stars and the sun for navigation. There are no stars, there are no sun. Are we going north? Are we going south? We have no idea where we're at or we're tracking. Finally, all hope was disappearing. I want you to recall the title the message this morning is called. It's called Hope Floats. Verse 21, since many were going without food, Paul stood up among them and said, you men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. I know I'm a prisoner, I know I'm on the bottom of the totem pole, and I don't want to be a know-it-all, but I did warn us that we shouldn't do that. Now you see where they're at. They're down here headed toward Egypt. Somehow something happens and they get blown around. At least this line is a little bit crooked and they end up on some island up there. And I want to show the rest of the verses now, beginning with verse 22. This is Paul still happening. Verse 22, Paul says, now I urge you all. We've thrown away the tackle. We've duct taped the ship together. We've thrown away the cargo. It looks like all is lost. Can I encourage you all to take courage? Because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For this night an angel of the God I belong to stood by me. For this night an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me. Verse 24 and said, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. That's how it's going to turn out. You're going to Rome and you're going to stand before Caesar. That's the end of the story. And look, God has graciously given you all those who were sailing with you. Therefore, take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way as it was told to me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Here's how it's going to happen. Paul uncovered, are you ready? Paul uncovered purpose in the storm. Purpose. To everybody else, all was lost. To Paul, God revealed purpose in the storm. You know that there's application for you and I in our lives there, isn't there? Remember Jonah's storm? Remember the ship was about to wreck, and they said, what's happening? And well, Jonah's the problem. Let's take Jonah and throw him off the ship. There was purpose in that storm. The storm that we talked about just this morning during our prayer time, there was purpose in that storm. The purpose in that storm was for Jesus to show them, I can calm the storm. You don't have to be afraid. You all still have a little faith. I've been doing this for you over and over and over. There was purpose in the storm. God is in charge of the storms and the ship and the people on those ships. Otherwise, we could not rest. God wants Clayton to rest in the storm, but he cannot rest in the storm unless he knows that God has purpose in the storm. Paul couldn't stop the winds, but Paul could remind them that there's purpose in the storm. We know that, don't we? You ready? You and I, we are the people who know these truths. You and I are the people who have hope. Nod your head if it's true. We're the people who have hope. We're the guy maybe at the bottom of the totem pole as a prisoner. We are the people who've got the hope that they need when they're walking through their storm. Because we know the God who has purpose in that. Look at Paul's message in verse 24. First of all, don't be afraid. How many times do we see that in Scripture? The life is falling apart. God says to us, number one, don't be afraid. Number two, God's purpose is bigger. It extends farther into the future than just this storm. Don't we need to be reminded of that when we're in the storm? This ain't the end. The sun will come out. God does have purpose. He's trying to do something in our lives. Number three, God, this is pretty funny. God has graciously given me a captive audience. I get to shipwreck with you folks. All you folks aboard ship, isn't it wonderful that we're all out here together on a boat? God's graciously allowed me to sail with you all. Some of you are sailors, some of you are prisoners, some of you are soldiers. Isn't it great that God's allowed me to share this wonderful time with you all? Verse 25, he says that not only don't be afraid, he says take courage. It's not a time to cower back. It's a time to take courage. Number 5, despite your unwise decisions, God's purpose will be accomplished. Isn't that a great truth in our lives? Despite sometimes Clayton's made bad decisions, God's purpose will be accomplished in your life. And number 6, this unwise voyage will be costly. This bad decision that we have made, it will not end in our death, but it will be a costly decision. Have you ever been there? My brother and sister, when storms occur in our world, the people around us, the people around you, are desperately looking for something to believe in, someone to be the voice of reason, hope, and peace. And it's us. It's us. In the dark part of the storm, God is exalting this preacher, prisoner, Christian who has a message of hope. Hope is about to float when all else has been thrown out to sea and lost. Verse 27, when the 14th night came, Dr. Luke started this chapter saying when it was time to sail, whatever that was. But here, he's back to documenting. He's writing the story down. He's counting days. He's got his ticker out. It was on the 14th day, when the 14th night came, We were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and in the middle of the night, the sailors thought that they were approaching land. They took a sounding, verse 28, and found it to be 120 feet deep. Well, that's a pretty impressive GPS. They probably took a rope with a weight on it, and they let it down until it stopped going down. They pulled it up and measured it, and it was 120 feet. When they'd sailed a little farther and they did a sound again, they found it to be 90 feet deep. 30 feet closer. We're getting closer to the shoreline now. Verse 29, then fearing that we might run aground. Oh no, the ground's coming up too close. What happens if we run aground and we're not in land and we've thrown everything overboard? We're in trouble. The fearing they might run aground in some rocky place, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Finally, in desperation, they decided to pray about it. You ever been there? All's lost and we're going to run aground. We're going to be completely lost. They put the anchors down and finally, they had a prayer meeting. Paul was probably looking around the corner thinking, maybe we should have done that earlier. Verse 30, some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They let down the skiff. Remember, the skiff was the escape. That's the rescue boat. They let it down, pretending they were going to put out anchors from the bow. Guys, we're going down here in the skiff and put some anchors out of the bow. Wink, wink, wink. Truth is, we're jumping in the skiff and we're out of here. Verse 31, by the way, there'll always be that group, won't there? You can sit here and pray if you want to. I'm not going to sit idle waiting to die. I'm taking action. I'm jumping on a rescue boat. Paul said to the centurion Julius and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. More incredible words from Paul. Hey guys, we're all in this together. They can't survive alone, and they're the sailors. We need their help. And those words are pregnant with truth about the world around us. We must stay together. These guys are the sailing experts. We need them, and they need us. Verse 32, then the soldiers cut the ropes, holding the skiff, and let it drop away. The soldiers were now listening to what Paul said, and they said, okay, we're going to cut the ropes, and we're going to let our rescue boat float away. Verse 33, when it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food. This was 14 days. He said to them on verse 33, today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore, I encourage you, I urge you to take some food, for this has to do with your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head. Why did they go for 14 days and not eat? Were they fasting? Maybe. Probably not. They just started praying last night. Were they seasick? Probably a whole bunch of them had not eaten in 14 days because food did not sound very appetizing to them. Were they preserving the food because they didn't know how long it was going to be before they found land? Perhaps that. We don't know exactly why. But for 14 days they hadn't eaten. Paul said, guys, it's time for us to celebrate. After he had said these things, verse 35, and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them, and when he broke it, he began to eat. Wow, the Lord's Supper right there on the ship, right before the ship was going to go down. Verse 36, they all became encouraged and took food themselves. And I tell you, this is the first time since courage or encouraged or any other words of life had been mentioned in many days. Can I remind you of this, and can I encourage you this? Confidence in God's promises is contagious. The world out there is swimming around in a storm, and they don't see hope. Confidence in God's promises is contagious. When we speak words of life, and when we speak words of hope to people who are on the boat with us in life and feel like they are drowning and all the cargo's been thrown off and they're surely going to die, the words of confidence in God's promises is contagious. When they hear us share those words of hope, it brings hope to them. Precious, verse 38, when they had eaten enough, amazingly, hang on, I left verse 37. 37, in all, there were 276 of us on the ship. The good doctor is documenting the story. He's gone around and counted twice and counted 3 times. Guys, there were 276 of us that had the Lord's Supper on the boat that night. Verse 38, when they'd eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. Remember, this was a grain ship headed from Egypt over to Italy. This was their life. This was their commerce. They were getting paid for this grain. If it didn't make it, they didn't get paid for this voyage. And as a last-ditch effort, they took all of the weight of that grain and they tossed it overboard. Not only was their food supply gone, but their commerce was gone. What did they have left now? They had nothing left. The image of the prodigal comes back to my mind. Everything was lost. And the prodigal left and spent everything he had and he was gone. Verse 39, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land. They didn't recognize. There's no big sign there that said, welcome to Malta, or welcome to Maui, or welcome to Honolulu. They didn't recognize the land, but they sighted a bay with a beach. Man, wouldn't that have been a great sight to see a bay with a beach? It doesn't matter what it is. It's a bay and a beach, and there's land and lights here. Sunlight's come. The daylight has come. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. Guys, raise the sails one more time. We're going to go as hard as we can and try to get to that beach. The beauty of a bay with a beach. Verse 40, after casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. So now the anchors are gone, and the ropes that held the rudders are gone. They are free sailing. Nothing left. No cargo, no tackle, no grain, nothing. No ropes, no rudders. They hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. Verse 41, they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow, or the front of the ship, jammed fast and remained unmovable. So it went into the ground, but the waves kept coming behind them, and that poor little boat, the front of it was stuck, and the waves were coming up, pounding the stern of the ship. It says, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves, that poor little ship was just sitting there, stuck in the sand, with the waves coming up behind it, tearing the boat apart. Cargo gone, tackle gone, grain gone, no anchors, no rudders, grounded at sea. Now the waves are about to destroy the boat, the only thing that's left. The soldiers' plan was, verse 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. Because you know that if you're a Roman soldier and you're in charge of these prisoners and these prisoners escape, you know what happens? You're going to get their fate. You're going to get the judgment. Soldiers are like, these guys are going to take off and run and they're going to swim away and we've got to kill them. Verse 43, but the centurion Julius kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. So he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. God's favor on Paul resulted in the saving of many lives. My sister, my brother, my Christian friend, may I say to you, I pray for you and I call you by name, that God's favor would rest on you. Because when God's favor rests on my life, do you know what that empowers me to do? To save the lives of many people around me. It was because of God's favor on Paul that these men's lives were saved. You've got a sphere of influence around you, don't you? All of us have a sphere of influence around us. As God's favor rests on my life, I am empowered to save the lives of many people around me. My dear brother, my dear sister. This was real favor, driven by the way that Paul had lived his life as a prisoner. Finally, verse 44, the rest were to follow, some on planks and some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone reached safely the shore. I hear the words in my mind. I can't help myself. The ships aground on the shore of this uncharted desert island. Gilligan, the skipper too, a millionaire and his wife. The movie star, the professor, and Mary Ellen, here on Gilligan's Isle. We don't know what island we're on. We don't know where it's at. But every one of us, 276 of us, have arrived safely alive on the island. I wonder what kind of revival broke out on that island on that morning. Remember Jesus saying these words, Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, telling his disciples, hey guys, you are the light of the world. A city that is situated on a hill cannot be hidden. Jesus is saying by you, By you, the world gets lit up. By you, the world gets direction. By you, the world gets purpose. By you, the world is saved from the storm. By you, the world has hope. I could just go around the room. I'll just start with Amy. Hey, Amy. There are people sitting around you at work in storms, and they are in need of some floating hope because they're drowning in the storm. Jim, at work every day, you go to classrooms full of young people living in this culture. They feel like they're out in a storm helplessly and hopelessly. They are in need, Jim. Those students are in need of some floating hope because they're drowning in the storm. I could just go across the aisle, Jay and Danae and Greg and Chris, and I could go all across the room and I would say to Clayton, Clayton, for you sitting in the cubicles around you, there are people in their lives right now who are in the storm. Maybe they've cast everything off. Maybe their life is hopeless. But do you know what, Clayton? They need hope that floats. And you've got it. Today, my friends, my brothers and sisters, hope floats. When all appears lost in hopelessness, hope floats. Hope energizes. It renews, it gives courage, it is contagious, it brings life, it restores life, it saves life. And that's my challenge to you today. The challenge is for you and it is for me. May I ask you to identify maybe, 276 people who are on the boat with you? Maybe it's just 27 people. Maybe it's a half a dozen people. Maybe it's just one other person that's around you that's on the boat and they're out on the storm and their boat is going down. That many, some number of people. Can I ask you, maybe just go ahead and close your eyes and think about the people in your life that are out on the storm. They're looking for stability. They're looking for somebody with words of hope. They're looking for some reason that they don't have to be afraid because they are afraid. They're looking for somebody to tell them to take courage because their courage is gone. You are, and I am the light of the world. Can I say today, finally, maybe today, that you are here and you're the person in the storm. Tossed about hopelessly, perhaps everything is lost with no end in sight. I have a word for you. God can take what's wrong and make it right. God can bring purpose through your storm. It might be costly. Maybe you've made a really, really stupid decision in your life. It might be really, really costly in your life. But you know what? God has purpose in that. He wants to bring us through that storm out the other side, and He wants to give us new life and new hope. Remember that song, the words of that song that says, all I had to offer Him was brokenness and strife, but He made something